The great gobs of gardenias. Are we still prattling on about prophecies? Piles of poppycock paper, which, oddly, currently is in very short supply. Too bad someone did not bother to prophesy about that.
Prophecy? I just don't buy that. Wrong, wrong, wrong. All right, let's talk about some of the criticisms when it comes to Old Testament prophecy. The first one, coincidence. What if Jesus randomly fulfilled the prophecies of the Messiah in the Old Testament? It's very possible. I mean, everyone fulfills prophecy sometimes. A lot of people are born in Bethlehem, it turns out. Of the house and lineage of David, born in Bethlehem, rides into Jerusalem on a donkey. My nephew rode into Jerusalem on a donkey. Is he the Messiah? No. Coincidence. Okay, what is the likelihood that he's a descendant of Abraham of the tribe of Judah in the house and lineage of David and born in Bethlehem? That he would be betrayed by a friend, that he would be sold for 30 pieces of silver, that he would be killed, that he would be mocked, that he would be beaten. All of these things it prophesies in the Old Testament. His hands and his feet would be pierced, as is recorded by the psalmist 700 years before the death of Jesus, that not one of his bones would be broken, that he would be buried in a rich man's tomb, and finally that he would rise again from the dead. All these things are talked about in the Old Testament, and Jesus fulfills them. The chance that anyone else would do even 3 or 4 of these things is very unlikely. So what did the gospel writers do? They changed the truth. That's how this happens. Never heard that one before. The gospel writers are just lying. They're altering the events in order to make them fit these Old Testament prophecies. Even the most liberal scholars will admit that all 4 gospels are written well within the lifetimes of the associates of Jesus of Nazareth, and they were well publicized and well known in the early Christian church. People who knew the truth very easily could have corrected the misleading, altered events in the gospels if they had so desired, but we have no record of this correcting of the altered fulfillment of prophecies in the New Testament text. To put it very directly, if the gospel writers were lying, there were plenty of people alive when they were written in order to correct the gospel accounts. Jesus decided that he was just going to fulfill all the prophecies. It's pretty easy when you think about it. Riding into Jerusalem on a donkey, so Jesus found a donkey and intentionally fulfilled it. That's just what he did. Look, there's absolutely no problem in saying that Jesus clearly intentionally fulfilled some of the prophecies. Why would he do this? Because he's claiming something. He's claiming, I am the Messiah. It's not to be sneaky. It's to announce to his observers who he is. No amount of intentional fulfillment can get you to the right place to be born. Additionally, why would you want to intentionally be crucified? What, did he pay the Roman guards to not break his bones? Just so it looks like after he's dead, he's fulfilled some random Old Testament prophecy? That doesn't seem very likely. Well, there is that. So maybe intentional fulfillment doesn't work for all of them, but it works for, the donkey in Jerusalem. All right, here's the best one that I got for you. The gospel writers purposely misread the Old Testament prophecies, obviously. Finally, we have the context argument, and there is something to be said about this. There is no doubt that some of the Old Testament texts were intended for something very specific and local to the time. However, it's not unusual for prophecies, or biblical text, or even ancient Jewish writings for that matter, to have layers of meaning. Meaning for the immediate time period, and then of course metaphor and layers on top of that. The way that Jewish people would understand prophecy very clearly is in this layered fashion. Like the passage, for instance, in Hosea, when Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt have I called my son. It's very clear that this prophecy is referring back to the Exodus. However, it can mean more than one thing. In fact, St. Matthew claims that it does mean more than one thing. If you really understand what Matthew is writing, not only is he using this prophecy, but he's twisting the understanding of it on its head, which makes it really quite marvelous literature also. Okay, let's review really quickly the main critiques for applying the prophecies of the Old Testament to Jesus of Nazareth as a fulfillment of the promised Messiah. The first would be coincidence. that Jesus coincidentally fulfilled the Old Testament prophecies. The second would be the altered gospel, that the gospel writers changed the story of Jesus in order to make it look like he fulfilled the Old Testament prophecies, even though he did not. The third would be intentional fulfillment, that Jesus just simply intended to fulfill the prophecies and did so. And the final one would be the context argument, which says we are misunderstanding these prophecies. Prophecies have essentially nothing to do with a Messiah. We can recognize that the coincidence argument is virtually impossible. It's very unlikely that someone is going to come along and randomly fulfill all these prophecies. While the altered gospel might be a good argument, if the gospels had been written a generation or two after the death of the generation surrounding Jesus, it's not a good argument given the fact that the gospels were written down within the lifetimes of the eyewitnesses of Jesus. The gospels could have very easily been corrected. The intentional fulfillment argument only works for a few of the prophecies, and it's very true that Jesus could have intentionally fulfilled several prophecies. Not only would I say that he did intentionally fulfill some of the prophecies, he did so to claim whom he was, that he was the Messiah. But you definitely can't fulfill all of them. Being born in Bethlehem, it's very difficult for the unborn baby to convince the mother where to go to be born. Additionally, when you think about fulfilling prophecies of dying, a shameful, torturous death, most people don't want to fulfill that prophecy. And then finally, rising again. I mean, I suppose it was intentional on Jesus's part, but rising again. And then finally, the context argument. In the case of many prophecies, yes, they were contextual, but in the Jewish understanding, and frankly, understanding of prophecies even with outside the Jewish tradition, it's expected that prophecies oftentimes have more than one distinct meaning. And so this also doesn't explain away the Old Testament prophecies. The final note on prophecies that I want to make, even if the prophecy thing holds absolutely no water, that does not detract at all from the argument that Jesus was who he claimed to be and that he did rise from the dead, defeating death itself. And we'll be looking at that next. The resurrection? Well, mushroom soup.